Welcome to another unit in this methodology toolbox. This time with a unit on moderators and mediators. So more or less with the impact tertiary variables can have on the relations which you currently study. Let's start with the moderators. Let's first consider we have an independent and a dependent variable. The independent impacts the dependent variable. And we want to study this relation. And it could be that we have a tertiary variable, here in the form of a moderator, which impacts as well the dependent variable. So up to this point, no problem, but also impacts the independent variable. And the last part, that's actually the moderating effect. The effect that the moderator and the independent variable are not independent of each other, but the moderator impacts the independent variable. So from the assumptions regarding, for example, linear regression, the independent variables would no longer be independent. That might be a problem because then something like multicollinearity can come up. So how can we take care of these moderators, of these moderating effects? Well, in our model, we can start by standardizing our independent and our moderator variable. In most cases, also the dependent variable. And that's not 100% necessary, but well, if you do this, might go with standardize all three of them. Then you calculate the interaction term or the moderating effect, which is moderator times independent variable, and include this interaction term into your model, which here I called the full model, and estimate this. And later on you check whether this interaction term becomes significant. If you have a significant interaction term, this means that the moderator variable is actually moderating the relation between the independent and the dependent variable. Usually, once you include this moderating effect, this interaction effect, this relation here either becomes smaller or becomes larger. And the difference between the model without the moderator and the model with the moderating effect, that's how strongly the moderator impacts the relation. So that's the strength of the moderating effect. So much for moderators. Mediators look more or less the same. Independent dependent variable, independent impacts dependent, and we have the third variable which also impacts the dependent. So far, they're exactly the same layout as with the moderator. The difference between moderators and mediators is that here the independent impacts the mediator and not the other way around. So we basically have two effects from the independent on the dependent. The direct effect, this line, and the indirect effect via the mediator. So like this. If we want to include this into a model, well, first we estimate our effect from the IV on the mediator, this part here. Then we estimate the effect from the mediator on the dependent variable. So we have this part. If we multiply these two, what we get is the effect, the mediating effect. So this indirect effect here. And then we only have to check whether this is significant. The problem, due to the fact that we multiply these two parts, these two effects, it won't be linear any longer. So we cannot use classical t-tests to test whether the coefficient here, the multiplication of two coefficients, is different from 0. So we would have to use other things like bootstrapping to get confidence intervals, which we can use to check whether this effect is actually significant or not. Well, once we establish the indirect effect, we can actually also use the undisturbed relation and consider the effect that if we also have the mediator's effect on the dependent variable, in how far this changes our direct effect. So whatever remains here is the direct effect, and as I mentioned before, the multiplication of these two will be the indirect effect via the mediator, will be the mediating effect. Well, that's everything on moderators and mediators so far. As I said, mediators, it's a bit more problematic than moderators. That's why if you work with mediators, either you have to do some additional work by hand, or in most programs you use like add-ons. For example, with SPSS, you can use the process add-on to actually test mediating effects. Well, with those closing remarks, I hope you enjoyed this session. I say goodbye and see you next time.